2 years ago, my friend Lamar took a martial arts class. One of the things he learned in that class is a technique that you can use to disarm somebody who's holding a gun. Now, the technique he learned, it's a really simple one. You take the person's wrist and you bend it backwards. That way they can't hold the gun anymore. Now, to train himself in this movement pattern, he partnered up with somebody in the class and he practiced this movement. So he went to his partner and he bent their wrist back, and then he took away a little plastic gun. Then he handed it back, and then he did it again, and again, and again. All in all, over the course of 20 minutes, he practiced this movement something around 200 times. 2 days later, late in the evening in the streets of New York, this is an absolutely true story, a guy steps out of the shadows and he holds him up at gunpoint. So I want to ask you, what do you think my friend Lamar did in that moment when the gun was pointed at him? Just shout it out. Okay, it's actually a two-part answer. A number of you, at least who I could hear, got it, at least the first part right. So the first thing that happened is he did what he was trained. He went to the person, he bent the wrist back, he took the gun away. It's the second part where the surprise happened. Any guesses? That's exactly right. As soon as he took the gun away, he immediately handed it back, and he got shot in the foot. It's a true story. Now, many of you are familiar with the neuroscience principle illustrated by this story. It's called neuroplasticity. And the basic idea is when you practice a new skill, the neurons inside your brain will actually rewire themselves to hardwire that skill into your nervous system. During the past decade, in the neuroscience community, our understanding of what was happening in Lamar's brain has expanded tremendously. And the fundamental breakthrough that's allowed that to occur is that imaging technology has progressed to the point where we can now look into your brain with such specificity. We can watch the neural pathways get built, and we can watch them as they dissolve. And with that, our ability to use technology to influence this neuroplasticity, to rewire, to upgrade the brain, has similarly expanded. And so during our time together, we're going to take a journey into this cutting-edge science of rewiring your brain. Now, you might be wondering, well, why does this matter to me? And you see, this neuroscience we're discussing, this is no longer theoretical. It's rapidly making its way into the commercial realm. Within the next 5 years, it is going to profoundly affect each and every one of you in this room. It is going to profoundly affect the workforce. Now, to the point of this forum, the impact that neuroscience is going to have on society, that has yet to be determined. There is a scenario under which neuroscience is just going to simply augment the gap that Robert Crandall was talking about, the gap between the haves and the have-nots. But if we use this technology appropriately, we have the opportunity to use it to directly power the goals of this forum, to empower the inclusive economy that we are about, to level the playing field. So as we take this journey into neuroscience together, we're going to make 2 stops along the way. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the foundational science that has created the revolution, and then we're going to look to the future. We're going to talk about where the industry is headed, how it's going to impact you, and how it is going to impact the world. You ready? Now, my knowledge about neuroscience, it doesn't come only from my training as a scientist. It's from my personal background as well. 14 years ago, I hit a low point in my life. I had just started my first company. It was a venture-backed business. It was going absolutely nowhere. I was working literally 16 hours a day. I was chronically exhausted. I was drinking coffee by the gallon. And not only that, for the first time in my life, my body started to give out on me. I weighed 20 pounds more than I do today. It wasn't muscle. I just felt stuck. And one morning, I'm standing there looking at the bathroom mirror, and I say, oh my God, David, you just look like a ghost. I mean, my face, it was so pale. And in that moment, I said to myself, I said, okay, enough. Something needs to change. Now let's put that story on the back burner for a minute. I want to tell you a bit about my background because it's very relevant to the rest of the story. See, I had an unusual childhood. I grew up in a family of scientists. My dad is the guy who invented bone marrow transplantation. My mom was a world-famous biochemist. No pressure, right? So the world I grew up in, the water we swam in, was the world of science and the scientific method. And then when I got older, I did what was expected of me. So I went to Harvard College and I went to Harvard Medical School. And just like my father, I became a doctor and a scientist. So now let's fast forward again. 14 years ago, I'm standing in front of the mirror, feeling completely stuck. In that moment, the strangest thought just popped into my head. I said, David, you're a scientist. What if you approached this moment the way that a scientist would? That became a turning point for me. That was the beginning of my journey into this world of rewiring science, because from that moment on, I started to look at my life differently. I started to observe myself objectively, kind of the way that a scientist looks at a lab rat. And the first thing I did is I started to measure things about myself. So I put an EEG set on, and I looked at my brain waves, and I looked at my heart rhythm, and I looked at my breathing patterns. I looked at my thoughts. Now, what was I looking for? I was looking for patterns, something that I could measure and correlate with how much my life sucked. Now, as those patterns started to emerge, then I started to do experiments on myself. And as you can imagine, I learned an enormous amount in that journey. I went down my share of rabbit holes. But here's the bottom line. The man standing in front of you today is an unrecognizably different man than the one you would have met 14 years ago. I'm not talking only about my hair. By virtue of measuring and testing my limits, mentally and physically, I fundamentally rewired who I am. I'll give you a couple examples. I turned around my health. Some of you may be aware that you can measure your body's biological age based on your blood chemistry, and that's different from its chronological age. Well, what I can report to you is my biological age today is 4 years younger than it was 10 years ago when I started measuring it. Now, I'll let you do the math yourself, but if you do your calculation correctly, you're going to discover that 15 years from now, I'm going to be 8. I improved my brain. My memory improved. My measured IQ went up. Perhaps most relevant to this forum, my rewiring process had a huge impact on my work. I turned my company around. When I started this whole process, the company was generating $7 million in revenues. We were losing a boatload of money. 18 months later, we grew it to $245 million in very profitable sales. After I exited that, I started 2 new companies. Both of them rapidly grew to $100 million. Now, please understand, I'm not sharing this with you to impress you. My intent instead is to impress upon you that the rewiring science we're talking about can be immensely effective. So, what's the science underlying the revolution? The seminal research experiment, which kind of created an industry we now call neuroperformance, was done 10 years ago, a place called DARPA. That's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's kind of the sci-fi arm of the military. The experiment was really simple. They asked the question, can you use neuroscience to distinguish the brain of an expert from a novice? And the task they picked for that was marksmanship, shooting a gun. The reason is everybody in the military has to shoot a gun. So they took 100 of the best snipers in the military, and they measured their brain waves while they were pulling a trigger. And then they compared those to novices. Here's what they discovered. They discovered that the experts knew how to get their brain into a state that they called the zone. And when the brain was in the zone, they would make the shot every time. the novices didn't know how to do it. Now, that was a pretty important discovery. But then they went on and they did something really cool. They invented this device. It's basically a high-tech sweatband, and if you look inside, you can see it's got some sensors on it, and here's what you do with it. You put it on your forehead, then it's got a little haptic motor, and you clip it onto your shirt. I just lost my echo, covering the mic. So here's what happens. The sensors in this headband are measuring your brain waves, and they're figuring out if you're in the zone or not. When you're not in the zone, this haptic motor buzzes. Then as soon as you get into the zone, the buzzing stops. Everybody with me? OK. They took novices, and they had them train with this. 10 minutes a day, 3 days a week for a total of 4 weeks. So 2 hours of training, all in all. They were rewiring their brain to learn to get in the zone. With this training, the novices moved 80% of the way up the learning curve toward being elites. They went to intermediate snipers, people who were unable to get to the elite status. 80% of them, with these 2 hours of training, became elites. They went back to the elites, and then those guys got better. And this became a monumental study in the neuroscience world, because for the first time, it demonstrated that we can use technology to play with the neuroplasticity of the brain to rewire and upgrade the brain. Now, since that time, building on this initial study, there have been thousands of research studies all asking the question, how can you use technology to upgrade the brain? And we can do crazy stuff today. We can use technology to double your brain's processing speed. We can triple the speed with which you learn any body of information. We can quadruple memory. You can reverse cognitive decline, and that's just the beginning. There's 5 new articles coming out every day on this subject. And so we're in the midst of a massive revolution in the neuroscience world and the beginning of a commercial revolution. That brings me to the second stop in our journey. Where's the field headed? How is it going to affect you? How is it going to affect the world? I'd like to tell you about a really exciting study we did at my company, the Platypus Institute, because I think it's going to give you a peek into where the future is. We worked with a group of portfolio managers from the finance industry. Some of you may be familiar with this. These are people, they typically work for hedge funds. They're allocated a large pool of capital. They sit in front of a whole bunch of monitors and they trade. And the guys we worked with, they were very active traders. During the course of the study, we put headsets on them. We monitored their brain waves continuously for 10 weeks while they were trading. So at the end of the study, we had data on thousands of trades, and we had thousands of hours of brainwave recording from them. And then we did an analysis kind of like the sniper study, and I think you're going to find these results to be fascinating. Here's what we discovered. We discovered that the portfolio managers' brains went in and out of 2 distinct states. In one of those states, their trades were consistently profitable, and in the other one, they tended to lose money. We saw this with all the portfolio managers. Now, why does that matter? Well, imagine for the moment that you run a hedge fund, you work with people like this. If you could put a headset on your portfolio managers and you could predict in advance of a trade whether it's going to be profitable or not, that would give you a huge competitive edge. Does that make sense? So if you think about it, it is inevitable that over the course of the next couple, 3 years, a small number of funds, banks, and so on are going to start doing this. They're going to put headsets on their portfolio managers, and it's going to give them a competitive advantage. And then as time goes on, within 5 years, within 6 years, we're going to get to the point where you have to do it. It's going to become a competitive necessity. And so in the very near future, we're going to be seeing a situation where in the finance world, thousands of people are going to be wearing headsets, tracking brainwaves, upgrading their brain, because it's a competitive necessity. But it doesn't stop just there. Imagine that you employ software engineers. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to put headsets on them, track their brainwaves, train their brain, because it can make them 25 to 30% more productive. You're going to see this in many arenas. You're going to see this with air traffic controllers. You'll see it with intelligence analysts. You'll see it with video gaming. You'll see it in education, where, as I told you, you can triple learning speeds. So that gives you a bit of a sense of where the field is going to be in 5 years. But now let's look a little further into the future. Let's look 10 years, 15 years into this is where it gets really exciting. Let me tell you about a study that came out 3 years ago from MIT. They took a bunch of mice, and with an old school training technique, they taught these mice how to run in a maze. Now, while they did it, they monitored the brain waves. They recorded it. They put those brain waves onto a very tiny microchip. They inserted that microchip into the brain of a mouse who didn't know how to run the maze. What do you think that mouse knew how to do? That's exactly right. They implanted a memory into the mouse. If you could take a microchip and implant a memory into, the brain of your significant other, is there anything that you would use? So I can tell you, based on science of this sort, it is very realistic to say that within 10 to 15 years, we're going to be doing crazy stuff. We're going to be able to give ourselves the ability to see sensory stuff we can't see, to see, say, example, in the ultraviolet spectrum like bees do. We will be implanting microchips in our brain so you can learn to speak another language, so you can expand your mathematical skills. We will be connecting our brains to other people's brains, to the Internet of Things. Today, if you want help navigating your way through the streets of Atlanta, you can download an app to your phone. 15 years from now, you will be able to download an app to your brain. You won't even have to worry about the screen cracking. And so within this next decade, neuroscience is not only going to create a massive industry, it is going to fundamentally change the human experience. Now, what are the societal implications here? Well, as a starting point, at least today, as with all new technology, neuroscience is admittedly increasing the gap between the haves and have-nots, because the only people who can afford this are the elites, the hedge funds and the pro sports teams and the like. But if we use it appropriately, we absolutely have the ability to have neuroscience not only upgrade the brains of the elites, but to upgrade all brains to serve the goals of this forum, to level the playing field. Now, what do I mean? As you take a workforce and as it is displaced, you can use neuroscience to radically accelerate the retraining time to put them back to work. If someone is doing a job and it gets harder and harder because of technology, you can upgrade their brain so they can keep up. And so as a result of this, we have the opportunity, if we work together, to use neuroscience to truly create a beautiful new world, to create what we call Human 2.0. Now, with that, we've come to the end of our journey together, at least for today. But before I leave, let me leave you with one final thought. In the words of Mark Twain, it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Now, one thing that many of us, including my former self, know is that it is getting harder and harder to stay relevant. If you want to survive, you just have to keep working harder and harder. But in this new world of rewiring your brain, that just ain't so. So I invite you to play with the possibility that you can dramatically upgrade your brain, that together we can dramatically upgrade the brain of the workforce, and with that, we can turn the equation on its head. May the science be with you.